She didn't knock. She walked straight through that gate like she owned the dirt beneath her boots. The foreman saw her first, a heavy-set woman in tattered clothes, gripping a cast-iron skillet like it was the only thing standing between her and the end of the world. He didn't even let her open her mouth. He laughed. Not a small laugh, the kind that comes from the gut, the kind that invites everyone around to join in. And they did, every last one of them. "Go on back where you came from, woman. This ain't a charity kitchen." She stood there while 30 men laughed at her, didn't flinch, didn't cry, just looked at that foreman like she was memorizing his face for a reason she hadn't told him yet. What happened next? Inside that cookhouse, inside those ledgers, inside this broken ranch, would shake Iron Ridge to its foundation. If you've ever been dismissed before you got a chance to prove yourself, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end, because what's coming will leave you breathless. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The boots had given out somewhere around the second week. Eliza Rowan figured she'd walked close to 200 miles by the time the silhouette of Iron Ridge Ranch came into view against the flat Montana sky. And she'd done most of it with a piece of burlap tied around her right foot where the sole had split clean off. The left boot held on, barely, but it squeaked with every step like it was begging her to stop. She didn't stop. She hadn't stopped in 23 days, not for anything that mattered. She stopped for creeks, to drink and to rest her feet in cold water for 10 minutes at a time. She stopped once when a thunderstorm came down so hard she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. But she got moving again when it passed, and she got moving again now because the alternative was standing still in the middle of nowhere with nothing but her skillet and whatever remained of her pride. The skillet was the one thing she hadn't questioned carrying. It had belonged to her mother, and before that her grandmother, and it weighed close to 8 pounds, which sounds like a small thing until you've carried it across Montana in August, with the sun pressing down on your shoulders like a hand that means to flatten you. Other women had told her to leave it. Practical women, sensible women. "You can find another skillet, Eliza. Why are you carrying that thing like it's your firstborn?" Because it was hers. Because everything else was gone. She didn't let herself think too hard about what was gone. That was a hole she could fall into and not climb out of, and she needed to stay on the surface of things for now. Stay practical, stay moving. She had a skillet, she had her mother's recipes in her head, every single one of them, all the way back to dishes her grandmother learned from her own mother in a county that didn't exist anymore on any map. And she had a body that had never once quit on her no matter how many people had assumed it would. She adjusted the bundle on her back, squared her shoulders, and walked through the front gate of Iron Ridge Ranch at 2:30 on a Thursday afternoon. The first thing she noticed was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, the heavy kind, the kind that settles over a place when the morale has gone out of it like air out of a punctured tire. She'd felt that kind of quiet before, and it had a particular weight to it that no amount of noise could disguise. She passed 2 cowboys mending fence near the gate, and neither of them looked up from their work, and their faces had that worn-down, going-through-the-motions look she recognized from a long way off. She walked toward the main house because that's where she needed to go. She had a purpose. She wasn't going to let herself wander around looking uncertain, because looking uncertain was an invitation. She found out very quickly that looking certain was too. There were maybe 8 or 10 men gathered near the water trough when she came around the side of the barn, some of them taking a midday break, some just passing through. One of them was a large man with a sun-leathered face and a jaw like a piece of barnwood, and he was standing with his arms crossed in a way that suggested he'd been standing that way for most of his life. He looked at her the way you look at something unexpected, not with curiosity, but with irritation. "You lost?" he said. "No, sir," she said. "I'm looking for the ranch owner. I heard there was a cook's position open." She said it plainly, without apology, the way her mother had always told her to say things. "Don't ask permission to be taken seriously, Eliza. State your business and let them catch up." The man looked at her. Then he looked at the skillet she was carrying. Then he looked at her again, and something shifted in his face, something mean and lazy and very pleased with itself. He laughed. It wasn't a private kind of laugh. It was the other kind, the kind designed to be heard, to spread, to collect an audience. And it worked exactly the way he meant it to. The men nearby turned to look, and when they saw what he was looking at, A big woman in ragged clothes, road-worn and half-limping, clutching a cast-iron skillet like some kind of desperate talisman. Several of them laughed too. Not all of them, but enough. "Cook's position," the man said, still grinning. "You hear that, boys? She come about the cook's position." "Leave her alone, Decker," said one of the younger ones. Not loudly, not with any real force behind it, but he said it. Decker wasn't the kind of man who responded to quiet protests. "I ain't doing nothing. I'm just wondering how in the—" He caught himself, reshaped whatever he'd been about to say into something that could pass for humor. "How a woman who walked what looks like 300 miles in one shoe is planning to feed 50 cowboys 3 times a day. That's all." The laughter spread a little wider. Eliza let it finish. She'd learned a long time ago that interrupting laughter was like trying to stop a cough. You just pushed it underground, where it would come out differently later. Better to let it run its course. Better to stand there and hold yourself like you were the most comfortable person in the county, because sometimes that's exactly what it took to make a man feel embarrassed for laughing. When the noise settled, she looked at Decker directly. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Granger if you don't mind," she said. "And if you do mind, I'd appreciate knowing your name so I can tell him who kept me at the gate." That got a different kind of reaction. A couple of the men looked away. One of them made a sound that might have been a suppressed snort of amusement at something other than her. Decker's face did a complicated thing. Surprise, then irritation, then something that wanted to be anger but wasn't entirely sure it was warranted yet. "Name's Decker," he said. "Wade Decker. I'm the foreman here. And I'm telling you now, woman, you're wasting your time." "That's my time to waste," she said. She waited. He stared at her. The standoff lasted about 15 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're standing in front of a man who outweighs you by 60 pounds of pure mean and you're wearing burlap on your right foot. Then a voice came from the direction of the main house. "Decker." One word, said without volume, without edge, but with the particular authority of someone who'd learned to mean what he said and didn't repeat himself. Eliza turned to look. He was maybe 55, lean in the way ranchmen get lean. Not thin, just worn down to the necessary parts. He had the kind of face that might have been handsome once, and was now just weathered and specific, the kind you'd remember. He was wiping his hands on a cloth as he walked toward them, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that told her he'd been watching from that porch for longer than he'd let on. "What's going on?" he said. Decker opened his mouth. Eliza spoke first. Not rudely. She didn't cut him off exactly. She just started speaking in the half-second before he found his words. "My name is Eliza Rowan," she said. "I'm looking for work. I heard Iron Ridge needed a cook. I can do the job, and I can start today if you'll have me." The man looked at her, not the way Decker had, not with the quick dismissal of someone deciding in the first second. He looked at her properly, which she noticed and appreciated in a way she didn't show. "Silas Granger," he said. "This is my ranch." "I know," she said. "You have a reputation for running a fair operation." He looked at the skillet in her hand. "You carry that the whole way here?" "Yes, sir." "Where'd you come from?" "Started outside of Billings." Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, more like reassessment. "That's—" He stopped. "That's a considerable walk." "Yes, sir." He looked at Decker. Decker had crossed his arms again and was wearing an expression that communicated clearly and without subtlety that he thought this was all a waste of everyone's afternoon. Silas looked back at Eliza. "You know what it takes to feed 50 working men?" he asked. Not cruelly, he was genuinely asking. "I do," she said. "I fed a logging crew of 62 for 4 years. Before that I cooked for a boarding house in Missoula for 6 years. Before that I cooked for my family, which is where I actually learned anything worth knowing." Decker made a sound. "You got any references?" Silas asked. "The logging camp burned down 2 winters ago," she said. "Foreman's name was Chester Pyle if you want to track him down. The boarding house closed when the owner died. His widow married and moved to Oregon. I've got nobody to vouch for me except myself." She said it straight, not apologetic, not combative, just factual. "This is the situation. Here are the facts. What do you want to do with them?" Silas rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the gate, then back at her, then at the cookhouse off to the east, a long, low building with a rusted stovepipe and windows that needed washing. "Our last cook left 3 weeks ago," he said. "Before that we had another one who lasted 2 months. Cooking for this many men isn't easy work. I know what it is, she said. The pantry's not in great shape. I can work with what there is. He looked at her for another long moment. Decker shifted his weight and said, Silas, in a tone that meant, don't be foolish without spelling it out. Silas glanced at him. Then he made a decision. Eliza could see it happen. The small thing that shifts in a person's face when they stop evaluating and start committing. 1 meal, he said. You cook supper tonight. 52 men. If it's good, if they eat it and come back for seconds, the job is yours. Fair? Fair, she said. Decker looked like he'd bitten something sour. Silas, we don't have time to… Wade. Just his name. Just that. Decker shut his mouth. Silas gestured toward the cookhouse. Rosa will show you where everything is, or what's left of everything. He paused. What's your name again? Eliza Rowan. Miss Rowan. He nodded. Good luck. He walked back toward the main house. Decker didn't move immediately. He stood there a moment, looking at her with something that had moved past irritation into something more deliberate, more patient. The look of someone who'd decided to wait rather than argue, because waiting was a kind of winning he was more confident in. Don't get comfortable, he said quietly. She didn't answer him. She turned toward the cookhouse. The woman who met her at the door was small and quick-moving, with dark eyes and hair going silver at the temples. And she introduced herself as Rosa Mendez in a way that suggested she'd introduced herself a lot of times and didn't expect it to matter much. She was the general housekeeper, she explained, and she'd been washing dishes and organizing what little food remained since the last cook left, and she was not shy about the state of things. It is not good, Rosa said, opening the pantry door. I want to tell you this before you see it, so you don't… She made a gesture that covered a range of unpleasant reactions. Eliza looked. The pantry was a long, narrow room off the main kitchen, with deep shelves on both sides, and the shelves had the particular sad look of shelves that were supposed to be full. There were 2 sacks of dried beans, one of which had been opened and partly used, a barrel of flour, maybe a third full, some dried herbs hanging from a hook, thyme, rosemary, something she'd have to smell to identify, a tin of lard, a half-wheel of cheese that had seen better days, a length of cured beef, the kind used more for flavoring than eating, hanging from a rafter, some onions going soft, salt, a small crock of molasses, a few jars of preserved tomatoes that someone had put up, she guessed, sometime the previous autumn. Delivery was supposed to come Monday, Rosa said. It didn't. Did they say why? They never say why. Rosa's voice was careful, not quite expressionless, but close. There was something in it that Eliza filed away without examining yet. What do you have fresh? Eliza asked. We have eggs, the hens are still laying, and Mr. Granger shot a deer 2 days ago. There is… Rosa paused, calculating. Maybe 15 pounds of venison left. Eliza looked at the pantry shelves again. She was running numbers in her head the way her mother had taught her. Not recipes exactly, but ratios. What would stretch? What would hold? What would carry flavor far enough to make people feel fed rather than just filled? How big is that stove? She asked. Rosa showed her. The stove was big, commercial scale, the right kind for a ranch cookhouse, iron and reliable looking even if it needed blacking. There were 2 Dutch ovens, a collection of mismatched pots, a decent roasting pan. The knives were dull. The cutting boards were old but solid. She could work with this. She set her skillet on the stovetop. Rosa watched her. You know what you're doing? She asked, and the question wasn't quite as skeptical as it might sound. It had a quality to it, like she was hoping to be convinced. I know what I'm doing, Eliza said. She wasn't performing confidence. She genuinely did know. This was the thing nobody had ever understood about her, the thing that the laughter at the gate had missed entirely. She wasn't someone who cooked because she'd had to, or because she'd had no other choice, or because it was what women of her background were expected to do. She cooked because she was genuinely, deeply, constitutionally good at it, the way some people are good at reading a room or reading the weather, and that kind of goodness doesn't leave you just because circumstances change. She tied on an apron and looked at Rosa. I need a fire going in 20 minutes, she said, and I need you to tell me everything you know about what happened to those supply deliveries. Rosa blinked. I'm the housekeeper. I know. Eliza said. But you've been here. You see things. And something tells me this pantry didn't empty itself. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, The deliveries have been short for almost a year. Mr. Granger, he doesn't always check the receipts himself. Decker signs for most of the orders. She said it carefully, like she'd been holding it carefully for a long time. Eliza nodded. She didn't push further. Not yet. She tucked that information somewhere useful and turned to look at her pantry again, because right now the most important thing, the only thing that mattered in the next 4 hours, was giving 52 tired, skeptical men a meal they wouldn't forget. She picked up a knife and tested the edge with her thumb. Dull. She found a whetstone on the shelf and sharpened it, slow and steady, the way her grandmother had shown her. Then she started to cook. She started with the beans because beans were thyme. They needed to go on first. They needed to be started in cold water with a piece of that cured beef and a quartered onion and enough salt to mean business. And they needed to understand they were being asked to become something worth eating. She talked to food sometimes when she cooked. Not out loud, not when anyone was listening. But in her head, she addressed ingredients the same way she'd address a person she wanted cooperation from, respectfully, specifically, without pretending she didn't need something from them. She broke down the venison herself. The remaining cuts weren't the best. They'd had a few days and needed strong flavors to pull them back, but she knew what to do with that. She'd learned to cook for people who were hungry and tired, not for people who were leisurely in particular, and hungry, tired people needed food that met them where they were. She got the venison into her skillet with lard and the browned bits of onion and let it sear until it was dark and smelling like something other than apology. Rosa had gotten the fire going and was now standing slightly to one side, watching. Not interfering, watching with the quality of someone reassessing a situation. The time, Eliza said without looking. Those bundles hanging. Bring them down, would you? And smell that rosemary before you bring it. If it's dusty, it's no good. It smells like rosemary, Rosa reported. Good. She made biscuits from the flour, cutting in lard until the texture was right, adding enough salt and a spoonful of the molasses, which was a trick she'd never written down because it was the kind of thing that sounds wrong until you taste it. She was working fast, but not frantic. There's a rhythm to feeding a crowd, and once you find it, rushing breaks it. You had to trust the rhythm. Outside, she could hear the ranch operating around the cookhouse. The sound of horses, the distant thump of something being unloaded, voices she couldn't make out. At one point she heard Decker's voice, louder than the rest, and whatever he said got a few laughs from someone nearby. She didn't pause. She added rosemary to the venison and reduced the heat. 2 hours in, Rosa said quietly, it smells different in here. Different how? Like something is actually happening. Eliza glanced at her. Rosa was still wearing her careful expression, but something behind it had relaxed. That's the beans, Eliza said. Give them another hour and they'll smell like your grandmother's kitchen. Rosa made a small sound, not quite a laugh, closer to recognition. At 5 o'clock, with 30 minutes to go, Eliza tasted everything for the last time and made adjustments. Another pinch of salt in the beans, a pull of the biscuits 5 minutes early to rest before serving, a thin pan gravy from the venison drippings that she was particularly satisfied with, though she wouldn't say so. She arranged the preserved tomatoes in a skillet with the remaining onion and some of the herbs and let them reduce until they were something worth eating on their own. At 5:30, Rosa opened the cookhouse door and rang the dinner bell. The men came in the way men come to meals when they don't have high expectations, in clusters, talking among themselves, with the low energy of people who've been working since dawn and have given up on being surprised by anything. Eliza stood at the back of the cooking area and watched them settle, and she watched the moment the smell hit them. It happened at different times for different men. Some of them paused just inside the door, some of them at the table when Rosa set down the first plates. The first man to sit down was one of the younger hands, maybe 22, with sunburned ears and the look of someone who'd been skipping lunch because the available food hadn't been worth the effort. He took one bite of the venison and looked down at his plate like it had said something surprising. "Hey," he said to nobody in particular. The man across from him looked up. "What?" "This is—" He didn't finish the sentence. He took another bite instead. Eliza watched Decker come in last, the way foremen often do, scanning the room first before committing to it. He took his plate from Rosa without looking at her, sat at the end of the table, and looked at the food in front of him with the particular expression of someone who'd already decided to be unimpressed. He took a bite. He didn't say anything. He didn't look up. He just took another bite. That, Eliza knew, was the best review she was going to get from that direction, and she took it. By 6 o'clock, the beans were gone. By 6:15, there wasn't a biscuit left. The young hand with the sunburned ears had come back for seconds before some of the older men had finished their firsts, and Rosa had to cut him off at thirds because there were men still coming in from the far pasture. Silas Granger came to the cookhouse at 6:30. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room, the empty plates, the men sitting a little longer than they had to, the low hum of conversation that had been absent from this place for months. And then he came to find Eliza. She was scrubbing the big skillet at the wash basin. She heard him come in and kept scrubbing. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Mr. Granger." "I heard from 12 men in the last half hour," he said. "I don't think I've had 12 men voluntarily talk to me about anything in months." She didn't turn around. "Was it good news?" "They want to know who you are and if you're staying." He paused. "So I need to know the same thing." She set the skillet down and dried her hands and turned to look at him. He was standing with his hat in his hands, not performing anything, just standing the way people stand when they're being straight with you. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Job's yours," he said. "Room's in the back of the main house if that suits you. Rosa can show you." He started to leave. Then he stopped. "You said you could work with what there is," he said. "I've been told the pantry was near empty." "It was." "Then what you made tonight, that's what I know how to do," she said. It wasn't bragging. It was just information. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something complicated in his face. Not admiration exactly, more like the careful recalibration of someone who'd expected something to go wrong and was figuring out what to do when it didn't. "Good night, Miss Rowan," he said. "Good night, Mr. Granger." He left. Rosa appeared in the doorway a minute later. "Mr. Decker," she said quietly. He came back. "After supper." He took a biscuit from the cloth I had them wrapped in. Eliza looked at her. "He didn't say nothing," Rosa said. "He just took it and left." Eliza looked at her iron skillet, clean and dry now, sitting on the stove. "Rosa," she said, "tomorrow morning can you show me where they keep the supply records, the order logs and the receipts?" Rosa's face did something careful and guarded. "Why?" "Because that pantry was empty for reasons that don't make sense," Eliza said, "and I'd like to understand them before I commit to feeding 50 men with nothing in the shelves." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes moved toward the door, toward the direction Decker had gone. "I can show you," she said. Then quietly, "but not where anyone can see." Eliza nodded. She didn't push it. She didn't need to. She hung up her apron, picked up her skillet, and followed Rosa down the hall. She didn't know yet what she was walking toward, but she'd walked 200 miles to get here, and she'd come this far on less than certainty, and whatever was hiding in those ledgers, whatever had been draining this ranch dry while 50 men ate short rations and lost the will to stay, she was going to find it. That was the thing about Eliza Rowan that nobody at Iron Ridge Ranch had figured out yet. She hadn't carried that skillet all the way from Billings because she was desperate. She'd carried it because she always finished what she started. The supply ledgers were kept in a wooden box under the desk in the ranch office, which was a small room off the main house that smelled like old tobacco and dried leather and something else. Something faintly anxious, like paper that had been handled too many times by hands that were nervous. Rosa brought her there just after 7 in the morning, 2 days after Eliza's first supper at Iron Ridge. The men were already out on the range by then, which meant the house was quiet in the way it only gets when the people who fill it with noise have temporarily gone somewhere else. Rosa unlocked the office with a key she kept on a small ring in her apron pocket, and she stood in the doorway while Eliza went to the desk. "How long have you had that key?" Eliza asked. "Mr. Granger gave it to me 3 years ago," Rosa said, "when his wife was sick. He needed me to get things from this room sometimes, and he couldn't always—" She stopped. "He trusted me with it." "And Decker? Does he have one?" Rosa's expression shifted. "He has the foreman's key. It opens the supply barn and the equipment shed. Not this room." She paused. "But he has been in here. Mr. Granger lets him in sometimes to review the order sheets." Eliza opened the wooden box. The ledgers inside were the standard kind, thick, cloth-bound, with columns for dates and items and quantities and prices. There were 4 of them going back about 6 years. She pulled the most recent one first and set it on the desk and opened it to the beginning of the current year. She was not an accountant. She'd never claimed to be. But she'd run a supply kitchen for 62 men for 4 years, and that meant she knew exactly how much flour cost per 100 pounds, how much dried beans cost per sack, how much salt pork ran per side in this part of Montana, and how those prices changed with the seasons and with the distance from the nearest town. She knew these numbers the way some people know hymns, not because she'd studied them formally, but because she'd lived inside them long enough that they'd become instinct. She started reading. The first thing she noticed was the flour. In January, Iron Ridge had paid $11.40 per 100-pound sack of flour. That was high, not impossibly high, not obviously fraudulent, but high. She'd paid $9.50 for the same flour in comparable conditions, in comparable weather, in a comparable location. The kind of high that could be explained by a bad road or a new supplier or just a run of bad luck with the markets. But in February, the price went up again. $12. In March, $12.50. She turned pages. By June, they were paying $14.20 per 100-pound sack of flour from a company called Harlan Supply out of Great Falls. And the delivery records showed they were receiving, she ran the column with her finger, 40 sacks per month. She did the arithmetic in her head. Then she did it again because the first time she got a number that seemed too large. The second time she got the same number. At $14.20 per sack, Iron Ridge was paying $568 a month for flour alone. A ranch this size, feeding this many men, would need roughly 30 sacks of flour per month in normal operation. 40 was high, but the price was what stopped her, because she'd seen flour at $9.50 per sack in Great Falls herself, 2 months ago, on her way through. She'd stood in the Harlan Supply loading yard, in fact, waiting for a man to give her directions, and she'd seen the price board on the wall. $9.50 per 100 pounds. Iron Ridge was paying $14.20 for the same flour from the same company, and they were buying 40 sacks instead of 30. She set that ledger aside and picked up the one from the previous year. Same pattern, starting lower, rising through the months. She went back 2 years, same thing. It wasn't a bad run of luck, it was a system. Someone had been inflating the prices on every supply order coming into Iron Ridge Ranch, and they'd been doing it incrementally, small enough each month to avoid attracting attention, large enough over a year to add up to something serious. Rosa was still in the doorway. She'd been watching Eliza's face. "You found something," Rosa said. It wasn't a question. "I found a lot of things," Eliza said. "How much does Mr. Granger know about what's in these ledgers?" Rosa looked at her hands. "He knows the ranch has been struggling. He thinks it's the drought 2 years ago. He thinks it's the cattle prices falling." She hesitated. "He doesn't look at the supply records himself. He trusted... She stopped again. "He trusted Decker to handle the ordering," Eliza said. Rosa didn't answer. She didn't need to. Eliza closed the ledger carefully and sat for a moment with her hands flat on the cover. She was thinking about the pantry, the near-empty shelves, the delivery that hadn't arrived Monday, the fact that 50 men had been eating short rations for long enough that it had become normal to them. She was thinking about the young hand with the sunburned ears who'd eaten like he was making up for skipped meals, because he probably was. She was thinking about that long column of inflated prices, month after month, for everything from flour to salt pork to lamp oil. She was also thinking about Decker's face when she'd told him she wanted to speak to Mr. Granger, the quick calculation behind his eyes. The way he'd said, "Don't get comfortable," not as a taunt, but as something closer to a warning. She put the ledger back in the box exactly as she'd found it. Then she looked at Rosa. "Don't say anything about this yet," she said. Rosa looked relieved and frightened in equal measure. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to cook breakfast," Eliza said. "And then I'm going to figure out what I'm actually dealing with before I say a word to anyone." She meant it practically. She needed more information before she brought this to Silas Granger, because going to a man with half a story was worse than going to him with no story at all. But she also meant it in a larger sense, because she'd learned, through years of operating in kitchens and supply rooms and places where she'd been underestimated, that the most dangerous thing you could do when you'd found something was let it show on your face before you were ready. She kept her face calm all the way back to the cookhouse. Breakfast that morning was sourdough flapjacks from a starter she'd found at the back of a shelf and coaxed back to life the night before. with the molasses thinned down into a syrup and some dried apple she'd found in a tin behind the flour barrel that she'd simmered soft in water, and cinnamon she'd discovered tucked into a small paper packet someone had forgotten. It wasn't elaborate, but it was hot, and it was real, and it smelled like something a person's mother might have made on a cold morning, and that mattered more than people generally admitted. The men came in quieter than they had 2 days ago, quieter in a good way, the way people get quiet when they've stopped bracing for disappointment. Eliza noticed that several of them said good morning to her, not as a formality, but as a thing they actually meant. The young hand with the sunburned ears, she'd learned his name was Pete Calloway, 19 years old and from somewhere in Wyoming, sat down and looked at the flapjacks and said, "Oh, thank the," and then caught himself and just said "thank you" instead, which made Rosa smile from the corner of the room. Decker came in last again. He took a plate, sat at the end of the table, and ate without comment. He didn't look at Eliza, but she noticed that he ate everything on his plate and didn't leave until it was clear. She spent the morning baking. She'd asked Rosa to find her any butter that existed on the property. There turned out to be a small churn and a cow that was still giving enough, and she made 2 loaves of bread and a batch of oatmeal cookies from oats she'd found behind the beans. Because she'd learned that a small thing like a cookie, something nobody was expecting, did more for a person's spirit than an elaborate meal eaten without surprise. She saved half the cookies for afternoon when the men came in from the range at their worst, tired and hot and starting to argue with each other over small things. At 2 in the afternoon, Pete Calloway came through the cookhouse door looking for a dipper of water and found a plate of cookies on the end of the counter with a cloth over it. He stopped. He looked at the plate. He looked at Eliza. "Those for after supper?" he asked. "Those are for right now," she said, without looking up from the bread she was slicing. He took one. He ate it in 2 bites. There was a pause. "Miss Rowan," he said. Are you planning on staying?" She looked up at him. He was serious, not making conversation, genuinely asking, with the look of someone who'd been let down enough times to need reassurance before he let himself care about something. "I'm planning on it," she said. He nodded. He took a second cookie. "Okay," he said, and went back out. 40 minutes later, there were 6 men in the cookhouse who'd found reasons to be there, and the plate of cookies was gone. She was cleaning up from that small, unplanned gathering when she heard Silas's voice from the doorway. "You're rebuilding this kitchen," he said. Not accusing, observing. She turned. He was leaning in the doorframe, his arms crossed, but loosely. Not the defensive posture she'd seen from Decker. Just a man looking at a room that looked different than it had a week ago. And it did look different. She'd reorganized the shelves, labeled things, fixed the hinge on the pantry door that had been hanging wrong, blacked the stove until it stopped looking abandoned, and hung a new set of pot hooks she'd asked the blacksmith to make her. A young man named Garrett, who'd seemed startled to be asked for anything by the cook, but had delivered them the same day. "Trying to," she said. He came into the room. He picked up one of the loaves of bread from the counter and looked at it and set it back down. "Rosa said you wanted to look at the supply records." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She'd told Rosa not to say anything yet, but she'd said it about the contents, not the request. She measured the situation. "Yes," she said. "Why?" "Because when I cook for people, I need to know what I have to work with and why I have what I have." She kept her voice level. "And the pantry when I arrived told me something was wrong with the ordering. I wanted to understand it." He looked at her steadily. "And do you understand it?" This was the moment. She hadn't fully decided how to handle it yet. She'd had 2 days, but she'd been cooking and observing and thinking, and she still didn't know how much Silas Granger was ready to hear, or how he'd react to hearing it, or whether she had enough solid ground to stand on yet. She made a decision. "Not completely," she said. "I'd like a few more days with the records before I say anything specific, if that's all right with you." He studied her. She could see him weighing it, the question of whether she was being evasive or whether she was being careful, and whether those 2 things looked the same from where he was standing. "You found something," he said. It wasn't quite a question. She understood then that he wasn't slow. He'd just been trusting the wrong people for long enough that he'd stopped asking certain questions. But the capacity was there. He saw things. He just hadn't been looking in the right places. "I found some things that need context before they mean anything," she said. "Give me until the end of the week." A pause. "All right," he said. He started to leave. Then he turned. The men they're different this week. I don't know if you know that. I've noticed, she said. Pete Calloway asked me this morning if the cook was permanent, he said. Pete hasn't asked me anything voluntarily since he got here. He just does what he's told and keeps his head down. He looked at her with something complicated, gratitude and something adjacent to regret, she thought, the look of a man who'd let something go to seed for too long and was starting to understand the extent of it. Whatever you're doing, it's working. She nodded. She didn't say anything self-deprecating, and she didn't deflect the acknowledgement, because both of those things were forms of dishonesty she'd stopped indulging in a long time ago. She just accepted what he said and let it sit. After he left, she spent an hour sharpening every knife in the cookhouse until they were right. And she thought about what she'd seen in those ledgers, and she thought about the delivery that hadn't arrived Monday, and she thought about what Rosa had said, that Decker signed for most of the orders. The next morning, she sent a message with the mail rider to Great Falls. She addressed it to the Harlan Supply Company, care of their accounts office, and she asked a simple question. What was the current price per 100 pounds of all-purpose flour for commercial accounts? And could they confirm the delivery schedule for Iron Ridge Ranch in Cutter County? She signed it as the new cook and household manager. She didn't mention Decker. She didn't mention anything about what she suspected. She just asked the question. The reply came back in 4 days, which was fast for what it was. The mail rider made good time because the weather held. She opened it in the cookhouse while Rosa watched from the doorway again, because Rosa had started treating Eliza's morning reading of any correspondence like something between ritual and theater. The Harlan Supply Company confirmed that their current commercial price for all-purpose flour was $9.65 per 100 pounds. They were pleased to serve Iron Ridge Ranch and looked forward to continued business. They had no record of any pending delivery dispute or scheduling change. They also noted in the second paragraph that they had recently updated their records at the request of the account holder's representative, a Mr. W. Decker, and were now billing through a new forwarding account. They hoped this arrangement was satisfactory. Eliza read that paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and looked at Rosa. He's running the money through a separate account, she said. Rosa sat down. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. She just seemed to need to be closer to the floor. How long has he been in here? Eliza asked. 7 years, Rosa said. He came 2 years after Mrs. Granger. Mr. Granger trusted him. After Mrs. Granger died, Decker was the one who kept things running. Mr. Granger he wasn't himself for a long time. She said it with compassion, not accusation. Decker took on more and more, and Mr. Granger let him. Eliza understood grief better than most people would have guessed. She understood how it could hollow a person out and leave them relying on whoever happened to be nearby, and she understood how the wrong person could see that as opportunity. Does anyone else know? She asked. Any of the hands? I don't know, Rosa said. I have thought sometimes. I have thought that some of the older men, the ones who have been here longest, that they know something is wrong, but they don't know what, or they don't want to know. What about the young ones, Pete? Pete just does his work, Rosa said. He doesn't know enough about how a ranch runs to see it yet. Eliza looked at the letter in her hands. She thought about the ledgers and the inflated prices and the forwarding account and the delivery that hadn't arrived and the near-empty pantry and 50 men eating short rations and Silas Granger who'd spent 3 years trusting the wrong person while his ranch bled out around him. She thought about Decker's face. Don't get comfortable. She understood now what he'd meant. He'd meant it as a threat with a timeline, because whatever his arrangement was with the Harlan Supply account, her presence, her looking at things, her asking questions, her reorganizing the kitchen and noticing what was missing, was a variable he hadn't planned for. She needed to talk to Silas. She needed to do it carefully, because Silas had trusted Decker for 7 years through his worst years, and that wasn't something you dismantled with a letter from a supply company and a ledger you'd been looking at for 4 days. She needed him to see it himself. She needed to give him what she had and let him arrive at the conclusion on his own terms, because conclusions that someone else delivered to a man who'd been betrayed at that level didn't stick the way conclusions did that a man found with his own eyes. She went to the office that evening after supper. Silas was there, working through paperwork at the desk, or trying to work through paperwork at the desk, which wasn't the same thing. He looked like a man wading through a task he understood the necessity of without finding any purchase in it. Mr. Granger, she said from the doorway, I need to show you something. He looked up. He read her face the way she'd read his. Not perfectly, but well enough. Sit down, he said. She sat. She put the supply ledger and the letter from Harlan Supply on the desk in front of him. She didn't explain everything at once. She walked him through it the way you'd walk someone through unfamiliar terrain, slowly, naming the landmarks, letting them orient before you showed them the drop. She showed him the flour prices. She showed him the month-by-month increases. She showed him the column totals and what she'd calculated the actual market price should have been. She showed him the difference, not dramatically, just as a number, because the number was dramatic enough on its own. Then she showed him the letter. He read it twice. She watched his face do the same thing she'd watched her own face do in the mirror when she'd first understood what she was looking at. A kind of stillness that wasn't calm. That was the opposite of calm. That was what a person's face does when something is reorganizing itself underneath it. A forwarding account, he said. Yes. He's billing through. The money for the orders is going through an account he controls. That's what it looks like. Silas set the letter down. He looked at his hands on the desk. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when a person is holding something back. 7 years, he said. She didn't say anything. This wasn't a moment for saying anything. He was at my wife's funeral, Silas said. It came out quietly, not quite directed at her. He stood right there and he stopped. He kept this ranch running when I couldn't. He ran it for himself, Eliza said, gently but straight. I'm sorry. Silas didn't answer immediately. She could see him working through the arithmetic of it, not the financial arithmetic, but the other kind, the accounting of a long trust and what it had cost him. How much? He asked finally. I'd need someone with more accounting experience than me to give you a real number, she said, but just from the flour alone over 3 years, looking at the difference between what you paid and what the market price was. She'd already done this calculation. Close to $4,000, and flour is only one line item. Silas looked at the ledger. He looked at the letter. He picked up the letter and read it again, as if the second time might change what it said. It didn't. Who else knows? He asked. Rosa knows what I've found, she said. Nobody else. Good. He said it with a deliberateness that told her he was already thinking practically, already moving from the blow to what came after it, which was either a sign of resilience or a sign that he'd been bracing for bad news for so long that his instinct was to keep moving before the feeling caught up with him. She thought it was probably both. I need to verify all of this, he said, before I say anything to Decker or anyone else. I need to know what I'm standing on. I know, she said. I wasn't suggesting you act immediately. I just needed you to know what I'd found. He looked at her. Why? He asked. Not suspicious, genuinely asking, with the directness of a man who'd learned to ask the questions he actually had. Because it's your ranch, she said simply, and because I'm cooking for the men who work it, and they deserve to have enough food on their plates, and they haven't been getting it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been here less than 2 weeks. Yes, sir. And you found this. I was looking, she said. It wasn't hidden very hard. It was just, she thought about how to put it. It was hidden from someone who trusted the person hiding it. That's a different kind of hiding. He nodded slowly. He looked down at the letter again. Then he looked up. I'm going to need help with the records, he said. There are 4 years of ledgers in that box, and I can't... He stopped. I don't want to miss anything. I'll go through them with you, she said. Evenings, after supper, when the cookhouse is quiet. That's more than your job asks of you. I know, she said. He looked at her in a way that was hard to read. Not quite gratitude, not quite relief, more like a kind of recognition, the way you recognize something you'd stopped believing was possible. All right, he said. Thank you, Miss Rowan. She stood. She picked up the letter and left the ledger on his desk because she thought he needed to sit with it a while on his own. She was halfway down the hall when she heard him say, quietly, as if he was saying it only to himself, 7 years. She kept walking. Supper that night was a venison and bean stew that she'd been building since noon. With the last of the bread loaves and a pot of rice, she'd managed to stretch by cooking it in the liquid from the preserved tomatoes, which added color and taste and made 50 men think they were eating something more complicated than plain rice. It was, Not a trick exactly, but a kind of generosity of attention that distinguished cooking from just putting food on the table. Pete Calloway ate 3 bowls of stew. "I'm going to have to start charging you," Eliza said when he came for the third. He grinned, a real grin, the kind that went all the way up. "You could try," he said. She ladled it out. He went back to the table. She watched the room, the posture of the men, the quality of the noise they made. 2 weeks ago, when she'd arrived, the cookhouse had been a place men passed through on their way to somewhere else. Now they lingered. They talked. 2 of the older hands, who'd apparently not spoken to each other in months, were arguing cheerfully about something at the far end of the table. Decker sat at his usual spot at the end. He ate without lingering. He left without looking at her. But at the door he paused for just a second. She was watching, so she caught it. The slight turn of his head, the way his eyes swept the room without settling on anything specific. Like he was checking something, like he was running account of something that mattered to him and making sure it still added up. She turned away before his eyes could reach her. She had 3 more days before she'd have enough from the ledgers to bring Silas something solid. Something with real numbers, with documentation, with the kind of clear line from action to consequence that made it impossible to explain away. 3 days was a long time when you were cooking for 50 men 3 times a day and rebuilding a kitchen from almost nothing and spending your evenings at a desk going through 6 years of supply records. But she'd walked 200 miles to get here. 3 days was nothing. The morning delivery arrived the next day, the one that had been late the previous Monday. She was at the barn when they unloaded it. She counted the sacks. 32 sacks of flour, not the 40 that were billed. She counted the salt pork sides. She counted the oil tins. She wrote every number down in a small notebook she'd bought from her own wages at the general store in town. The driver was a thin young man who handed over the invoice without making eye contact. She signed for it, then looked at the invoice. 40 sacks of flour billed. 32 delivered. The difference, at $14.20 per sack. She put the notebook in her apron pocket and went back to start the breakfast fire. She said nothing to anyone. She just cooked. The notebook filled up faster than she'd expected. By the end of that first week of evening sessions with Silas at the office desk, Eliza had cross-referenced 4 years of supply invoices against 3 different sets of price records she'd requested from merchants in Great Falls and Billings, prices that came back through the mail rider and confirmed, line by line, what she'd already suspected. The flour overcharge was the largest single item, but it wasn't the worst of it. Salt pork, lamp oil, grain for the horses, lumber for repairs, even the soap she used in the cookhouse. Every category had been quietly inflated, some by 10%, some by 30%, a few by amounts that made her sit back in her chair and stare at the ceiling for a moment before she wrote the number down. She brought Silas the totals on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her first supper at Iron Ridge. She'd organized everything on 2 sheets of paper, the actual market prices on one side, the prices Iron Ridge had paid on the other, and the difference in a third column that she'd added up at the bottom. She set it in front of him and let him read it. He read it without speaking. She watched his hand on the desk. He pressed his fingers flat against the wood once, like he needed to feel something solid. "Over 4 years," he said. "Yes." "This number at the bottom?" "Yes." He looked at it again. The number was just over $19,000. She'd checked her arithmetic 3 times because she hadn't wanted to believe it herself. "That's—" He stopped. Started again. "That's close to what the drought cost me in '89. "I know," she said, though she hadn't known that specifically. She'd known it was significant. The drought years were written in those ledgers too, in a different way. In the reduced herd counts, the lower feed orders, the careful tightening of everything that told the story of a man trying to hold on. Silas set the paper down. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. "I want to confront him," he said. His voice was controlled in the way that required effort. "I want to walk out there right now and—" "I know," she said again, "but you can't. Not yet." He looked at her sharply. She didn't back away from it. "If you confront him now, he'll deny it," she said. "He'll say the prices were market rate, and you don't understand supply costs, and the mail rider must have brought you bad information. And then he'll know we're looking, and the ledger you actually need, the one that shows where the money went, will disappear before you can find it." Silas was still looking at her. The sharpness in his eyes wasn't anger at her, she realized. It was the controlled fury of a man who was working very hard to think straight, when thinking straight was the last thing his body wanted to do. "What ledger?" he asked. "There's a second set of books," she said. "There has to be. The forwarding account Rosa, that I found in the Harlan supply letter. That money is going somewhere. To document that, to take this beyond a civil dispute and into something a county judge would actually act on, you need to find where it went." He absorbed that. "You think he keeps records of his own?" "He's been doing this for years, methodically, incrementally," she said. "Men who operate that way keep records. They can't help it. It's the same instinct that made him good at running a ranch, the habit of accounting for things." She paused. "The question is where?" Silas rubbed his jaw. He was looking at the wall of the office, at the square of darker paint where a photograph had hung for years and been taken down. She'd noticed that square before and hadn't asked about it. She still didn't ask. "The supply barn," he said slowly. "He keeps a lockbox in the supply barn. I always assumed it was for petty cash, wages for day workers, that kind of thing." Eliza waited. "I've never looked in it," he said. He said it with the flat quality of a man acknowledging a mistake he can't undo. "It was his domain. I trusted him with it." "Do you have a key to the supply barn?" she asked. "I have a key to everything on this property," he said. "It's my property." She nodded. "Then we wait until he goes into town." "He goes—" Silas looked at her. "How did you know that?" "Rosa mentioned it, and I've been paying attention to his schedule for 2 weeks." She said it without apology. "Saturday morning after breakfast. He usually leaves by 9 and comes back by 4. Silas stared at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize. That look of recalibration, of a man adjusting to the reality that someone in his cookhouse had been running a quieter investigation than he'd realized. "All right," he said. "Saturday." She stood up. She gathered her papers and started for the door. Then she stopped, because something had been sitting at the back of her mind all evening, and she'd been deciding whether to say it. "Mr. Granger," she said, "this has been going on for 4 years. That's a long time to maintain something like this without support. Decker doesn't strike me as a man who works alone." Silas frowned. "You think someone else on the ranch—" "Not necessarily on the ranch," she said carefully, "but someone. A scheme this size, sustained this long, with money being redirected through a separate account, that takes either a very sophisticated single operator or someone with help." She let that sit. "I'm not accusing anyone. I just think you should be ready for the possibility that what we find Saturday is bigger than one foreman." She left him with that. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the room Rosa had shown her at the back of the main house, a small room, plain, with a window that looked out on the equipment shed, and she stared at the ceiling and ran through everything she knew and tried to find the edges of what she didn't know yet. That was the thing about uncovering a deception. It expanded. Every answer opened into 2 more questions, and you had to be disciplined about which ones mattered and which ones were just the natural anxiety of someone who'd started pulling on a thread and didn't know how long it was. She got up before 4 and went to the cookhouse and started the breakfast fire, because physical work was the only thing that quieted the part of her brain that wanted to run ahead of itself. Friday passed slowly. She cooked, she organized, she made notes. Pete Calloway helped her move a heavy shelf in the cookhouse afternoon and stayed to talk afterward. He was the kind of young man who talked in a circling, approaching way, like he wanted to get to something but couldn't quite find the straight path to it. He talked about Wyoming, about his family's small operation there, about why he'd come to Montana. She listened. She asked a question here and there. At one point he said, "Has it always been like this here? The food, I mean, before you came?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I only know since I arrived." "It was bad," he said. It came out with the flatness of someone stating weather. Half the time the deliveries were short, and Decker would say it was the supplier's fault, and we'd just eat less. Or not eat at all, if it was late in the week. He looked at the floor. 3 guys left in March, said the food wasn't worth the work. I almost went with them. "But you stayed," she said. He shrugged. "Didn't have anywhere else lined up. And the work itself is good, the land is good." He looked up at her. "Mr. Granger's decent. He's been gone for a while. Even when he's here, he's been somewhere else." Eliza thought about Silas pressing his hand flat on the desk. "He's coming back," she said. Pete looked at her. There was a question in it. "I think he's paying attention again," she said. Pete nodded slowly. He picked up the end of the shelf they'd moved. "Where do you want this?" "Over there," she said. "Against the south wall." Saturday morning, she cooked a full breakfast: eggs, salt pork, fresh bread from the overnight dough she'd started Friday evening, and a pot of strong coffee that she kept refilling until Decker pushed back from the table and stood and reached for his hat. She watched him leave from the cookhouse window. She watched him saddle his horse, speak briefly to one of the older hands whose name she'd learned was Burl, and ride out through the front gate at 8:50. She gave it 20 minutes. Then she went to find Silas. The supply barn was a long building south of the main house, solidly built, smelling of hay and iron and old rope. Silas unlocked the main door and they went in together, and Eliza stood just inside the entrance while he moved through the dim interior toward the back wall. The lockbox was there, on a shelf above the spare harness hooks. A metal box, dark green, about the size of a bread loaf. There was a padlock on it. Silas produced his key ring, tried 2 keys before finding the right one, and opened the box. Inside there were papers, folded, and beneath the papers a small cloth-bound book, thinner than the supply ledgers, the kind you'd carry in a coat pocket. Silas took out the book first. He opened it. She watched his face. She saw the moment he understood what he was reading. It wasn't dramatic. His face didn't collapse, didn't rage. It just went very still in the way she'd come to associate with Silas Granger being confronted with something that required him to hold himself together. He handed her the book without speaking. She read the first page, then the second. Then she stopped and looked at him. "Harlan Croft," she said. Silas's jaw tightened. "Harlan Croft owns the Croft Land Company," he said. "He's been trying to buy Iron Ridge for—" He stopped. "For years. Since before my wife died." He stopped again, and she heard something in the silence around that sentence that she didn't press on. "I always said no." "The money from the forwarding account," she said, looking at the ledger again. "It's split. Some of it goes to an account in Decker's name in Great Falls. The rest," she turned the page, "goes here, to an account labeled CLC Holdings." "Croft Land Company," Silas said. "Decker wasn't just stealing from you," Eliza said. She kept her voice level because one of them needed to be. "He was taking a cut, and the rest was going to Croft. Croft was funding it, or at least collecting from it." Silas put his hand on the shelf beside the box to steady himself. Not a dramatic gesture, just a man needing to borrow support from something for a moment. "Why would Croft—" he started, then answered his own question before she could. "The water rights," he said. "Iron Ridge sits on the only clean running water in this valley. If this ranch fails, if I can't keep up with, if the finances go under—" He looked at the ledger in her hands. "He gets first offer. We had an agreement when I bought the property. A right of first refusal if I ever sold." Eliza looked at the numbers on the page. A ranch that was being quietly bankrupted over 4 years, short provisions, inflated costs, money siphoned out in increments small enough to blame on bad luck or drought or falling cattle prices, would eventually reach a breaking point. The owner, exhausted and financially stretched, would have to sell. And the buyer, who had been engineering the failure all along, would be right there with a low offer and a legal agreement already in place. "He was going to take your water," she said. "My water rights cover 6 neighboring homesteads," Silas said. "Those families, their wells depend on access to the Ridge Creek. If Croft controls the water—" He pressed his lips together. "Those people would have to leave or pay him whatever he asked." The weight of it settled in the barn around them. Eliza held the ledger and felt the full shape of the thing. Not just a ranch being defrauded, not just a foreman's greed. A plan to displace families from their land by destroying the one operation that kept the water accessible to everyone. She handed the ledger back to Silas. "We need to copy everything in this box," she said. "Every page, every number, in your hand and mine both. We put the originals back exactly as they were, and we keep our copies somewhere Decker can't find them." She was already thinking through the steps. "Then you need to write to the county courthouse in Haverford and request a circuit court investigator. Don't use the ranch's mail. Send it from town, with the supply run Monday." Silas looked at her. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about it all week," she said. "I didn't know what we'd find, but I knew we'd find something, and I knew what it would need to hold up." He looked at the box, at the papers still folded inside it. "What do I tell Decker? He can't know we've been in here." "You don't tell him anything yet," she said. "You act the same. I act the same. We give him nothing to react to until the investigator arrives. She paused. Can you do that? It was a real question, not a tactful one, and she knew it might land hard. She asked it anyway. Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. I sat across the table from that man for 7 years, he said. I can manage a week. They spent 2 hours in the barn. Silas copied the ledger entries in his careful, squared handwriting, while Eliza copied the folded papers. Receipts, account records, a letter in Croft's own hand that was not quite explicit enough to be a confession, but was close enough to be damning in context. They worked without talking much, passing papers back and forth. And outside the barn, the ranch operated around them. The sound of horses, the distant voice of Burl instructing somebody about something, the ordinary noise of a Saturday morning. When they were done, Eliza slipped her copies into the notebook in her apron pocket. Silas folded his into a sealed envelope that he tucked inside his shirt. They put the originals back in the green lockbox exactly as they'd found them, the cloth ledger on top, the papers beneath, the padlock closed. Walking back to the main house, Silas said quietly, Decker's been with me since my wife was alive. I know, she said. She liked him, he said. She thought he was reliable. Eliza didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say to that, and she'd learned long ago that trying to fill that kind of silence was more about the speaker's discomfort than the listener's need. They walked the rest of the way without speaking. Decker came back at 3:30 that afternoon, a little earlier than usual. Eliza was in the cookhouse starting supper, a large pot of beef and vegetable soup, because she'd finally gotten a proper delivery and the shelves had actual food in them for the first time since she'd arrived, and she wanted the men to feel that change in their plates. She heard his horse in the yard, heard him speak to someone near the barn, heard the ordinary sounds of a man returning from town. She kept stirring the soup. At 4 o'clock, Decker appeared in the cookhouse doorway. He didn't come in, just stood in the frame the way he'd been doing since she arrived, asserting presence without committing to it. Smells different in here, he said. New delivery came in, she said. Better provisions. He looked around the kitchen. His eyes moved across the reorganized shelves, the clean stove, the row of properly labeled tins. Something in his face was working through an assessment. You've made yourself at home, he said. That's generally what happens when a person has a job, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She kept her back to him and kept stirring. You write a lot of letters, he said. It came out casual, but it wasn't casual. Rosa mentioned you've been using the mail writer regular. Coordinating supply prices, she said, without hesitation and without emphasis. Comparing what we're paying to market rate. Part of managing a kitchen. She felt rather than saw the pause behind her. That's Decker's job, he said. Supply management. Supply management and kitchen management overlap, she said pleasantly. I don't imagine you want to be bothered with flour prices and soap orders. Another pause. Longer this time. No, he said. I don't. He left. She let out a breath she hadn't been entirely aware of holding and went back to the soup. Rosa appeared from the hallway 10 minutes later with the look of someone who'd been listening from around a corner, which she had been. He knows something is different, Rosa said. He suspects something is different, Eliza said. That's not the same thing. He doesn't know what, and he doesn't know how much. She tasted the soup and added a pinch of salt. Keep acting normal. I am always normal, Rosa said with a dignity that was almost funny. I know, Eliza said. Keep doing that. The letter to the Haverford courthouse went out Monday with the supply run, sealed and addressed in Silas's hand. The circuit investigator, they'd been told, typically took 2 to 3 weeks to respond to a request, sometimes longer, depending on the season and what else was demanding attention in the county. That meant weeks of maintaining the surface of things while the pressure built underneath. It was harder than it sounds. Decker started watching her more carefully. Not obviously, he was too experienced for obvious surveillance, and that was in its own way more unnerving than if he'd been blunt about it. He started timing his appearances at the cookhouse differently, showing up at odd hours, asking questions about supply costs in ways that were designed to sound like passing interest, but were actually probing. He asked Rosa twice in 1 week, where Eliza had been the previous Saturday morning. Rosa told him she'd been cleaning the root cellar, which was what Eliza had told her to say, and which was close enough to something Rosa would plausibly know that it held. Silas, for his part, did exactly what he'd said he would do. sat across the table from Decker at the evening meals, talked about cattle and fence line and the weather, and gave nothing away. Eliza watched him do it and felt a complicated respect for him because she knew what it was costing. She could see it in the set of his shoulders at the end of the evening, in the way he moved through the house with the deliberate carefulness of someone who'd set down a heavy thing and knew they'd have to pick it back up in a few hours. 2 weeks after the letter went out, something happened that changed the timeline. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning. Eliza was in the cookhouse when she heard raised voices in the yard. Not unusual, ranches were loud places, but the quality of this was different. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Pete Calloway was standing in front of the water trough, with his hands at his sides and his chin up in the way young men stand when they're trying not to back down from something they probably should back down from. Decker was in front of him, a foot taller and 30 pounds heavier, and whatever he was saying it quietly, which was more frightening than if he'd been shouting, because quiet anger from a man like Decker had a quality of precision to it. 2 other hands were nearby, watching with the careful non-involvement of people who'd learned that picking sides cost you. Eliza walked toward them. She didn't run. Running would have drawn the wrong kind of attention, and given the situation a drama it didn't need. She walked at a pace that covered the distance without looking hurried, and she came up beside Pete and said, "Pete, I need that barrel moved to the south door when you have a minute." Pete looked at her. His jaw was tight. I need that barrel," she said. "It can wait 5 minutes if you're in the middle of something." She looked at Decker when she said the second part. He looked at her. The air between them had the particular compressed quality of 2 people who understood each other a great deal more than they'd acknowledged out loud. "We were having a conversation," Decker said. "I could hear that," she said. "I just need Pete for a minute, if you're done." A beat. Decker's eyes moved from her to Pete and back to her. She didn't look away. She stood exactly where she was and held his gaze with the same energy she'd used at the front gate 3 weeks ago. Not combative, not yielding, just present. He stepped back. Not graciously. He made it clear it was his choice to step back, that he was not being moved. But he stepped back. Pete followed her toward the cookhouse. When they were inside, she turned to him. "What was that about?" she asked quietly. Pete looked at the floor. "He asked me about the mail rider," he said. "Whether I'd seen anyone send anything from the ranch without going through him." Eliza was still. "He said all official ranch correspondence goes through the foreman," Pete said. He searched for the word. "He was making a point of it, real specific like." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Pete said, "because I don't know anything." He looked up at her. His eyes were direct, open, and slightly alarmed. "But, Miss Rowan, what's going on? Something's going on, and I'm not the only one who's noticed." She looked at him. 19 years old, Wyoming ranch kid, sunburned ears, 3 bowls of stew. The kind of young man who stayed when he should have left. Not because he was passive, but because he was loyal to something even when that something didn't deserve it yet. "I can't tell you everything yet," she said, "but I need you to trust me for a little longer." "Is Mr. Granger in trouble?" "He's going to be fine," she said. "But I need you to not react to anything Decker does or says for the next week or 2. Can you do that?" He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated more than a fast yes. "Probably," he said. "Yeah." "Good," she said. She pointed at the barrel by the north wall. "And actually move that to the south door because I genuinely do need it there." He almost smiled. He picked up the barrel. That evening, she went to Silas before supper. "Decker's asking about the mail," she said. Silas's face tightened. "How much time do we have?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "He's being careful, which means he's still unsure what he's looking at. But he's looking." "The investigator?" "Could be another week," she said. "Could be 2. Silas stood up from the desk and walked to the window. He stood there with his arms crossed, looking out at the ranch. His ranch. The one his wife had loved. The one he'd been fighting for without knowing exactly what he was fighting. And his back was very straight. "I'm not waiting 2 weeks," he said. She'd been afraid of this. "Silas?" "I'm not confronting Decker," he said, turning. "I know what you said about that, but Harlan Croft's operation is in Mill Haven, 20 miles east." He looked at her steadily. "I know the county land agent there. Man named Tolliver, Arthur Tolliver. He's been agent for 15 years. He knows every legal claim in this valley. And if Croft has been building a case to acquire this land, If there are any filings, any preparatory documents, Tolliver would know. He paused. If I ride to Millhaven tomorrow and come back with that information, we have it from two directions. She thought about it. I was right that it would strengthen the case. She also knew he wanted to go because sitting still while his ranch was being used against him was eating through him like rust through iron, and that she couldn't entirely argue with. Take someone with you, she said. It's a 20-mile ride. Take someone anyway. He looked at her. You're worried Decker will... I'm worried about everything right now, she said flatly. Take Garrett, the blacksmith. He's solid and he's not connected to any of this. Silas nodded slowly. All right. And come back before dark, she said. Don't give Decker a long window of you being gone. He picked up his hat. He looked at her in the doorway. Something in his face that she had learned to read these past weeks as the version of gratitude that didn't know how to be spoken yet. Miss Rowan, he said. Go find your land agent, she said. He went. She turned back to the stove and lifted the lid on the soup pot, and the steam rose in her face, and she stood there in it for a moment with her eyes closed, not praying, just breathing, collecting herself, reminding herself what she was doing and why. She'd come here for work. She'd come here because she had skills and nowhere to use them and nothing left to lose. She hadn't come here to dismantle a conspiracy or protect 50 men's livelihoods or stand between a grieving rancher and the man who'd been stealing from him for 7 years. But here she was. She opened her eyes and picked up the ladle. Supper was lamb stew that night. Real lamb, from the delivery, tender and slow-cooked with the rosemary and the last of the dried thyme, and a quantity of onions that made the whole cookhouse smell like something worth coming home to. The men came in with the usual noise and settled into something quieter when they tasted it, the way people always did. That particular hush that happened when food was better than expected, when the body received something that felt like being cared for. Decker ate his portion. He said nothing. He left at the usual time. But at the door he paused, the same pause she'd noticed before, the same slight turn of the head, the same sweep of the room. This time, his eyes stopped on her, just for a second, just long enough. Then he walked out. Eliza set down the ladle. She looked at the cookhouse full of men eating her food and not knowing what was moving around them, and she felt the weight of knowing press down on her in a way she hadn't let herself feel until right now. She was in the middle of something that was bigger than a kitchen and bigger than a pantry and bigger than one ranch's survival. She'd understood that intellectually for a week, but standing there with the smell of rosemary in the air and Pete Calloway passing his bowl to the man next to him who'd missed the initial serving, she felt it in a different way. In the chest, in the stomach, in the same place her mother's voice lived when it told her to pay attention. She was paying attention. She washed the big pot and hung it back on its hook and banked the fire for the night, and she did not sleep well. But she did not sleep alone in her worry either, because worry shared between two honest people is a different animal than worry kept entirely to oneself. And she knew now that Silas Granger was carrying exactly his half of it 20 miles east on a dark road toward Millhaven. That was something. She held on to it. Silas came back from Millhaven the following evening with Garrett riding beside him and a leather satchel across his saddle that he carried into the house without stopping to speak to anyone. Eliza heard the horses in the yard and gave it 10 minutes before she followed him inside. She found him at the office desk, the satchel open, papers spread across the surface in the organized disarray of a man who'd gotten more than he'd gone looking for and was still processing the shape of it. He looked up when she came in. His face told her enough before he said a word. Croft filed a preliminary acquisition claim on this property 8 months ago, he said. Tolliver found it in the county record. It was filed quietly, not publicly announced, just entered into the land register as a pending conditional claim. He looked down at the papers. Conditional on the current owner defaulting on operational viability, which is a legal phrase that means, if the ranch can't sustain itself financially, she said. Yes. He put his hand flat on the papers. Tolliver says he's never seen a filing like it on a working ranch. He says it would only hold up in court if someone could demonstrate that the ranch had been mismanaged to the point of insolvency. He paused, which is exactly what the supply fraud was designed to produce. Eliza pulled the chair from the corner and sat down. She needed to sit down. He planned the exit before he finished the entry, she said. It came out quieter than she intended. He started draining the ranch and at the same time filed the legal mechanism to take it when it fell. She looked at Silas. How long ago did Croft buy the Harlan supply account connection? Tolliver didn't know that specifically, Silas said, but the first supply inflation in the ledgers, 4 years ago, she said. And the acquisition filing was 8 months ago, he said, which means he spent 3 years building the financial damage and then filed when he was confident the numbers were far enough gone to support the claim. He sat back in his chair. The lamp on the desk threw shadows across his face that made him look older than he was, or maybe just as old as the last several weeks had actually made him. He was waiting for me to come to him. He thought I'd have no choice. He didn't know you'd hire a new cook, Eliza said. Silas looked at her. Something moved across his face, the complicated intersection of things that were almost funny and things that were not funny at all. No, he said. He didn't account for that. The circuit court investigator arrived 11 days later. His name was Edmund Ferris, and he was a compact, gray-haired man in his late 50s who rode in on a Thursday morning with a deputy and 2 canvas bags full of the kind of paperwork that suggested he was not a man who made trips he didn't intend to finish. He introduced himself to Silas at the main house and shook hands once and didn't waste time on pleasantries, which Eliza appreciated from the cookhouse window where she watched the arrival. Silas had told her the night before that Ferris was coming. He'd also told her that he wanted her present for the initial meeting, not because it was customary, but because she'd built more of the evidentiary foundation than anyone else, and Ferris needed to understand that. She'd said she'd be there after breakfast was cleaned up. She walked into the main house sitting room at 9:15 with her notebook and her copies of the supply ledger annotations and the Harlan supply correspondence and the delivery count discrepancies she'd recorded in the weeks since she'd arrived, all organized in the order she'd present them, and she sat in the chair by the window and waited while Silas introduced her to Ferris. Ferris looked at her with the evaluating attention of a man whose job required him to assess quickly whether a person was reliable. He looked at her notebook. He looked at her face. "You're the cook," he said. "I'm the cook," she confirmed, "and you compiled this." "Over the course of about 3 weeks, yes." He held out his hand for the notebook. She gave it to him. He read through it for 4 minutes without speaking, turning pages with the careful deliberateness of someone who read documents for a living and knew what he was looking for. When he got to the delivery count page, the one with the flour sacks, 32 delivered against 40 billed, with her notation of the date and the driver's name, he stopped and read it twice. "You counted the sacks yourself," he said. "Yes." "And wrote it down the same day?" "Yes." He looked at Silas. "The ledger copies?" Silas produced them from the desk drawer, his copies and hers together, the ones they'd made in the supply barn on that Saturday morning 3 weeks ago. Ferris spread them on the table beside the notebook and looked at the 2 sets of handwriting side by side. "The originals are still in the lockbox?" he asked. "As far as I know," Silas said. "We'll need to secure those today," Ferris said. He said it with the calm of someone adding an item to a list he'd already started. "Before the foreman has any indication this is happening." He looked at Silas directly. "Where is he now?" "Out on the North Range," Silas said, "checking fence line with 2 of the hands. He'll be back by noon." Ferris looked at his deputy, a tall young man who'd said nothing and appeared to be conserving words for some later emergency. "We have 2 hours," he said to the deputy. The deputy nodded and went to get his bags. What happened next moved faster than Eliza had expected, which she supposed was the point. Ferris and his deputy went to the supply barn with Silas and retrieved the lockbox, and Ferris cataloged every item inside it with a methodical thoroughness that was almost painful to watch. Every paper unfolded, every entry noted, every account number copied into his own records. He found 3 things in the box that hadn't been there when she and Silas had looked 3 weeks prior: a second letter from Croft, more explicit than the first, and 2 bank drafts made out to W. Decker in amounts that removed any remaining ambiguity about the nature of their arrangement. Decker had been adding to the box. He'd felt safe enough to keep adding to it. She found that detail, the small confidence of a man who'd operated without consequences for too long, more disturbing than almost anything else she'd learned about the situation. He'd been so sure of himself that he'd kept the evidence in the same place it had always been, because in 7 years nobody had ever looked. Ferris had the lockbox contents photographed, and the originals sealed in one of his canvas bags by 11 o'clock. He came back to the main house and sat at the desk and wrote 3 documents in quick succession: a formal evidence notice, a restraining order request, and something else that he didn't name but sealed before Eliza could read the heading. At 11:45, Decker rode into the yard. Eliza was in the cookhouse. She heard the horse, heard the particular rhythm of Decker's dismount. She'd been listening to it for weeks and knew the sound of it, and she stayed exactly where she was and kept doing what she was doing, which was preparing the noon meal for 52 men plus 2 unexpected guests. She heard voices outside. Then she heard the quality of the voices change. She didn't go to the window. She kept her hands on the work in front of her and breathed steadily and listened to the shape of what was happening outside without being able to hear the words. Rosa appeared in the cookhouse door 4 minutes later. Her face was doing something complicated. Ferris showed him the evidence notice, Rosa said. Decker, he didn't... She stopped. He didn't yell. He just went very still. And then he said he wanted a lawyer. That's what people say when they know they're caught, Eliza said. He looked at the main house, Rosa said. When they were walking him to... Ferris said he needed to stay on the property for now, that he couldn't leave until the county sheriff arrived. She swallowed. Decker looked at the main house, and then he looked at the cookhouse. Her voice dropped. I think he knew. I think he figured out it came from here. Eliza set down the knife she'd been holding. She looked at Rosa. He's not going to do anything, she said. It came out steadier than she felt. How do you know? Because Ferris is here and the deputy is here and Silas is watching and there are 50 men on this property, she said. He's not stupid. He knows when something is over. Rosa looked at her with the expression of someone who wanted very badly to believe that and was working on it. Go set the tables, Eliza said gently. Lunch in 40 minutes. Rosa went. Eliza picked up the knife and kept working. The county sheriff arrived the following morning from Haverford with 2 men and a warrant. The conversation between the sheriff and Ferris lasted an hour, during which Decker sat in the bunkhouse under the deputy's watch and said nothing further that anyone reported. When it was done, the sheriff spoke to Silas privately, and then he spoke to Decker, and then Wade Decker rode out of Iron Ridge Ranch with the sheriff's men on either side of him and did not look back at the cookhouse. Eliza watched from the window. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel relieved, exactly. She felt the particular exhausted settledness of someone who has been holding their breath for a long time and has finally been given permission to exhale. Pete Calloway appeared at her elbow. She hadn't heard him come in, which meant she was more tired than she'd realized. He's gone? Pete said. He's gone, she said. Pete was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the retreating horses. I never trusted him, he said. Not that I knew anything, he had a way of looking at things like they were already his. Some people do, she said. Is it over? She considered the honest answer to that. The worst of it is over, she said. The rest is paperwork and court proceedings, and that takes time. But the ranch, she looked at him. The ranch is going to be fine. Pete nodded slowly. He picked up the broom from the corner, which was not something she'd ever seen him do without being asked. I'll sweep the cookhouse floor, he said. She looked at him. It needed doing last week, and I kept not doing it, he said. I'll do it now. She moved out of his way. The case against Wade Decker took shape over the following weeks with the particular grinding momentum of legal processes that have good documentation and competent people behind them. Ferris made 2 more visits to Iron Ridge, each time arriving with more questions than the last, and leaving with more answers. The Harlan Supply Company, when presented with Ferris's evidence request, produced their own internal records, the original invoice prices, the forwarding account setup paperwork, the name of the Harlan employee who'd processed Decker's arrangement, and those records were, if anything, more incriminating than what Eliza had found in the supply barn. The Harlan employee in question was a man named Vic Sutter, a mid-level accounts manager who had apparently been taking a smaller cut of the arrangement in exchange for processing the inflated invoices without question. Sutter, when interviewed by Ferris's office, decided that full cooperation was in his interest and provided a written account of how the arrangement had been set up, who had initiated it, and when the first payment to the CLC Holdings account had been made. The answer to that last question was 4 years and 3 months ago, 3 weeks after Silas Granger's wife had died. Eliza heard that detail from Silas directly, one evening when they were working through the latest set of Ferris's questions at the office desk. He told her without particular expression, which was how she'd come to know he delivered information that had cost him something. Flatly, specifically without decoration. She looked at the desk for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and she didn't push, and they went back to the paperwork. But later, washing up in the cookhouse before bed, she let herself be angry about it in a way she hadn't allowed during the day, the specific, focused anger of someone who understood exactly what it meant to target a man in his worst grief, to use his loss as a door. It was the part of the whole scheme she found hardest to set down. Harlan Croft's involvement took longer to establish formally, but Ferris had been right when she'd assessed the letter they'd found in the lockbox as damning in context, with Sutter's testimony and the bank draft records and the acquisition filing. Tolliver had found in the Millhaven County Register. Ferris built a picture that he described to Silas as persuasive to any reasonable judge, with the understated confidence of a man who'd won these kinds of cases before. Croft, for his part, hired 3 lawyers and issued a public statement through the Haverford paper claiming he'd been the victim of a dishonest intermediary and had no knowledge of any fraudulent supply arrangement. Nobody who read the statement appeared to believe it, including, Ferris implied, the judge assigned to the preliminary hearing. The preliminary hearing was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Iron Ridge kept running. This was, Eliza came to understand, the less dramatic but more important part of what was happening. The legal case would resolve itself, or it wouldn't. She had reasonable confidence it would. But she'd learned enough about legal processes to know that confidence was not the same as certainty. What she could control was the daily operation of a ranch that had been undermined for years and needed to find its footing again, and that work happened in the cookhouse and in the restored supply ledgers, and in the simple fact of 52 men eating 3 full meals a day for the first time in longer than most of them could clearly remember. She renegotiated the supply contracts herself, with Silas's authority behind her and her own price research in front of her. She wrote to 4 different suppliers in Great Falls and Billings and got competitive quotes, and she chose 2 of them based on price and reliability and the straightforwardness of their correspondence. The new contract prices were, across the board, between 12 and 20% lower than what Harlan Supply had been billing at the honest market rate, not the inflated one, and the first full delivery under the new arrangement arrived on a Tuesday morning with every item accounted for and the invoice matching the delivery to the sack and the side and the tin. She counted everything herself. She always would. The pantry filled up properly for the first time. Eliza stood in it for a moment after the delivery was stacked and shelved, stood in that long, narrow room that had been nearly empty on her first day, that had smelled of absence and resignation, and she looked at the full shelves and felt something that wasn't pride exactly, but was adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a problem solved through patience and attention. The particular pleasure of a room that looked the way it was supposed to look. She reached up and straightened a tin of lard that was slightly crooked. Then she went to start supper. The change in the ranch's atmosphere was gradual and then sudden, the way these things always are. A slow accumulation of small differences that tips at some point into something you can feel in the air. The men stopped having the worn-down going through the motions qualities she'd noticed when she first arrived. They started staying later at the supper table. Conversations got longer. Arguments, the good kind, about work and methods and who'd made the better call on the south pasture, started happening again, which Silas told her meant people were engaged enough to care about outcomes. 2 of the hands who'd given notice before Eliza arrived came back. They'd heard things had changed, they said. They wanted to see for themselves. She cooked for 54 men that week and didn't adjust the portions. Burl, the older hand who'd been at Iron Ridge longest, 12 years, Rosa had told her, came to the cookhouse one evening after supper when the room had mostly cleared. He stood in the middle of the floor with his hat in his hands, which was a posture that told her he'd been working up to something. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Burl." He looked at his hat. He was a man of about 60, compact and weathered, with the particular dignity of someone who'd spent decades doing physical work without complaint and expected nothing for it. She'd respected him from the beginning without knowing much about him. "I knew something was wrong with the supplies," he said. "For a long time, 2, maybe 3 years. He kept looking at his hat. I thought about saying something to Mr. Granger, more than once." She waited. "I didn't," he said. "I told myself it wasn't my place. That Decker handled it, and I didn't have enough to say. I didn't have proof, just a feeling and some numbers that didn't add up when I thought about them too hard." He paused. I should have said something anyway. Yes, she said. You should have. He looked up quickly, like he'd expected something softer than that. But not saying something when you're uncertain and have no proof is different from knowing and staying quiet, she said. You didn't know. You had a feeling and no ground to stand on. That's a hard position. I could have looked harder for the ground, he said. You could have, she agreed, but you're here now. He nodded. He put his hat back on. He turned to go, then stopped. That first night, said, not turning around, when you came through the gate and Decker laughed, I didn't laugh. I want you to know that. I know, she said. I noticed. He walked out. She stood in the empty cookhouse for a moment after he left, thinking about the things people carried, the guilts and the almosts and the I should haves, and how most people carried them silently for years until something changed enough that they could put them down. She'd been carrying her own version for longer than she wanted to think about. Different shape, same weight. She banked the fire. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, Harlan Croft's lead lawyer approached Ferris with a settlement proposal. Croft would withdraw the acquisition claim, repay a negotiated sum to Iron Ridge to cover documented supply losses, and accept a consent decree barring him from any future business dealings involving Iron Ridge or any property on the valley's water rights corridor. In exchange, Croft would not face criminal charges for his role in the scheme, only civil liability. Silas brought the proposal to Eliza's attention the same evening he received it. He sat across from her at the cookhouse table. Not the office, the cookhouse, which had become the place they talked about things that mattered, and spread Ferris's summary of the terms in front of her. She read it. What does Ferris recommend? He says the criminal case against Croft is solid but not airtight, Silas said. Croft has good lawyers, and the argument that he was deceived by Decker has some surface plausibility even if nobody believes it. A civil settlement guarantees the acquisition claim dies and guarantees some financial recovery. Criminal prosecution would take another 1.5 years minimum and might deliver a conviction or might not. What does Decker get out of this? Nothing, Silas said. The settlement is Croft's. Decker's criminal case proceeds regardless. Ferris says Decker's exposure is clear. The bank records, Sutter's testimony, the ledger. He'll be convicted. Eliza looked at the papers. She thought about the valley's water rights. She thought about the 6 neighboring homesteads Rosa had mentioned, families whose wells connected to the Ridge Creek, who had no idea that a land baron had spent 4 years trying to take control of what they drank. If Croft accepts the consent decree, she said, he can never touch this water again. Any legal claim is closed. That's Ferris's assessment, Silas said. Then take the settlement, she said. Make sure the consent decree language is specific. Ridge Creek access rights and all tributary claims, not just the Iron Ridge parcel, every connected property. Silas looked at her. Ferris said essentially the same thing. Then Ferris is right, she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely there, but she caught it. The settlement was formalized 2 weeks later. The acquisition claim was withdrawn and entered into the county record as permanently abandoned. The repayment, not the full amount of the losses, but a negotiated figure that Ferris described as reasonable given the avoidance of litigation risk, was transferred to Iron Ridge's accounts within 30 days. It wasn't everything that had been taken. It was enough to rebuild on. Decker's case went to trial the following spring. Eliza didn't attend. She heard about it from Silas, who went one day to give a statement and came back in the evening and ate the supper she'd kept warm for him and told her the verdict in 2 words: guilty, sentenced. She nodded. She put his plate in front of him and sat across the table with her coffee and didn't ask for more details than he gave, because she could see he'd said what he needed to say, and the rest of it he needed to just eat and let sit. The morning after the verdict, Pete Calloway came to the cookhouse before breakfast and told her that the men wanted to do something. She asked him what he meant. He said they'd talked about it, the hands, the ones who'd been there through the worst of it, and the ones who'd come back. And they wanted to fix the cookhouse roof, which had been leaking in the northwest corner since September, and which she'd been working around with a bucket and a repositioned shelf. You talked about this collectively? She said. Burl organized it, Pete said. He said it was embarrassing that the cook's roof was leaking and nobody had fixed it. She looked at him. Tell Burl I appreciate it. He says it's nothing. Tell him anyway. They fixed the roof on a Saturday, 4 of them, and they did a competent job and only had one significant argument about the correct angle of the replacement shingles, which Pete won on the merits, and which Burl acknowledged with the gruff brevity of a man who was right about most things and could afford to be wrong about one. Eliza made lunch for all of them and brought it up on a tray, which caused a small amount of chaos because nobody expected to be handed food on a roof, and there was a moment where a biscuit almost rolled into the yard. But nobody dropped anything important, and the roof held, and the northwest corner of the cookhouse stayed dry through the rest of October and into November. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of thing that matters. The evening after the roof was done, Silas came to the cookhouse at the end of the day, which he did regularly now, had done since somewhere in the middle of all of it. The timing so gradual she couldn't have said when it had become a habit. He sat at the table and she gave him coffee, and they talked about the supply order for the following month, and about Pete, who Silas was considering for an expanded role in the spring, and about a repair needed on the east fence, and about whether the weather was going to hold. At some point, the conversation moved away from ranch business, the way it sometimes did, into quieter territory. He told her something about his wife, not much, just a detail, the way a person tests the water before they wade in, about how she'd wanted to plant a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, but had never gotten around to it because there was always something more urgent. He said he'd been thinking about doing it, starting it anyway, in the spring. Eliza said she thought that was a good idea. She said she knew which herbs would establish well in Montana soil and which ones wouldn't bother. He looked at her across the table and said, "You planning on being here in the spring?" She looked back at him. "I'm planning on it," she said. It was the same thing she'd told Pete weeks ago in the same room. But it meant something different now, and they both understood that. And neither of them pushed past it that evening because some things need to be arrived at slowly by people who've both been burned by arriving at things too fast. She refilled his coffee. He thanked her. Outside, the ranch settled into its evening sounds. Horses, wind, the distant creak of the barn door that Garrett had been meaning to fix and would get to eventually. And the cookhouse smelled like wood smoke and the remnants of supper and the faint, clean scent of the pine soap she used on the counters. Iron Ridge Ranch at night, in November, 3 months after a ragged woman had walked through the gate with an iron skillet and changed the accounting of everything. The roof didn't leak. The pantry was full. The men were fed. It was enough. For now, it was exactly enough. Winter came to Iron Ridge the way it always did in Montana, without apology and ahead of schedule. The first hard frost arrived in the second week of November, and by the end of the month the ground was frozen solid, and the Ridge Creek had a skin of ice along its edges each morning that Pete Calloway broke with a pole before the horses came to drink. The days got short and the work got harder in the specific way winter work is harder, not more complicated, just heavier, colder, requiring more of a body that has less warmth to spare. Eliza adjusted the cooking accordingly. This was something she'd always understood intuitively. What people needed on their plates changed with the season and the work and the weight they were carrying, and a cook who didn't pay attention to that was just someone who put food in front of people, which was a different thing entirely. She moved toward heavier stews, toward slow-cooked cuts that had been braising since morning, toward bread that came out of the oven 20 minutes before the men came in from the cold, so the warmth of it was still in the crust when they sat down. She started the kitchen garden planning in December. This was practically speaking a slightly absurd thing to do in December in Montana, but planning was not the same as planting, and she'd learned from her grandmother that the worst thing you could do with a Montana winter was let it convince you that spring wasn't real. You planned in the cold. You drew the beds on paper and decided what went where and ordered seeds while there was still time for them to arrive before the ground thawed. The planning was the commitment. The planting was just the follow-through. Silas found her at the kitchen table one evening in mid-December with a hand-drawn grid of the South Yard and a seed catalog from a company in St. Paul. He stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the spread of papers. "Rosemary," she said, without looking up. "It'll establish here if we start it in containers inside and move it out in May. Same with the time. The hardier herbs, sage, chives, those can go directly in the ground once the frost is reliably passed." He came and sat across from her. He looked at the grid. "You've thought about this." "I've had time," she said. "December is good for thinking." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the diagram. She'd drawn it carefully, to scale as best she could estimate, with the sun angles noted for each bed. Her grandmother had taught her to think about light first, always light first, Because you could amend soil and you could add water, but you couldn't move the sun. Margaret wanted basil, he said. My wife, she said she couldn't cook without fresh basil, and I told her basil wouldn't grow this far north, and she said that was because nobody had tried hard enough. Eliza looked up. He was looking at the drawing, not at her. She was probably right, Eliza said. It needs a warm microclimate. The south wall of this house would do it, if you built a low stone border to hold the heat. He looked at her then. Could you do that? Garrett could build the border, she said. The basil is the easy part. Something in his face settled, not relaxed exactly, more like something that had been held at a slight tension for a long time was given permission to ease. He looked back at the diagram. She looked back at the catalog. They sat like that for a while, the lamp between them, the winter pressing against the windows. And it was comfortable in the way that only happens between people who've been through something hard together and come out the other side still willing to sit in the same room. Outside, someone crossed the yard. The footsteps were Pete's. She'd learned all their footsteps by now, which struck her sometimes as a strange and specific kind of intimacy, knowing a person by the sound they made moving through the world. I've been thinking about Pete, Silas said. So have I, she said. He's ready for more responsibility than he's got, Silas said. I've been watching him the last couple of months. He thinks well under pressure, he doesn't panic when something goes wrong, and the men listen to him even though he's younger than most of them. He paused. That last part is the hard part to teach. You can't teach it, she said. Either people follow someone or they don't. Pete has whatever it is that makes people decide to follow. I want to offer him a senior hand position in the spring, see how he carries it. He'll carry it well, she said. She meant it without qualification. She'd watched Pete these past months, watched him with the same attention she brought to everything. And what she saw was a young man who paid attention to other people, who noticed when someone was struggling and did something practical about it, rather than just feeling bad from a distance. That quality was rarer than it looked. He told me something last week, Silas said. He said that when you first arrived and he asked you if you were staying and you said you were planning on it, he said that was the first time since he got here that he believed someone meant what they said. Eliza looked at the catalog. She didn't say anything. I thought you should know that, Silas said. I appreciate you telling me, she said. She turned a page in the catalog. He reached across and turned it back, pointing at the herb section she'd just passed. What about that one? He said. Lemon thyme. That's a good choice, she said. It's heartier than it sounds. January arrived and the ranch contracted the way ranches do in deep winter, tighter, more internal, more dependent on the small radius of what's immediately around you. The outdoor work shrank to the necessary, feeding livestock, maintaining equipment, keeping water from freezing in the troughs. The indoor work expanded to fill the space, repairs, mending, inventory, the slow, careful accounting of a property that was finally being accounted for honestly. Ferris sent a letter in the second week of January confirming that Decker's sentencing had been completed, 3 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, with a civil judgment against him for the portion of the losses that Croft's settlement hadn't covered. The civil judgment was largely theoretical, Ferris noted, since Decker had no significant assets, but it was on the record, which meant it was real. Silas read the letter at the breakfast table and then set it down and finished his eggs. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't need to. Burl, who was sitting 2 seats down and who Eliza had come to understand noticed most things without appearing to, looked at Silas once, and Silas looked back, and something passed between them that was the compressed version of 7 years and everything that had happened inside them. Then Burl asked Pete to pass the coffee, and Pete passed it, and breakfast continued. Eliza stood at the stove and felt something she couldn't entirely name, a kind of fullness that had nothing to do with the food, the sense that a thing had been completed, that the accounting was finally, genuinely closed. The second week of February brought something she hadn't expected, a visitor. His name was Tom Aldridge, and he came from one of the neighboring homesteads. The Aldridge family ran a modest cattle operation 4 miles to the northwest, one of the 6 properties that depended on the Ridge Creek water rights that Croft had been trying to acquire. He came on a Thursday afternoon, asked for Silas, and was shown to the main house sitting room by Rosa, who came to the cookhouse afterward with the compressed look of someone carrying information. He says he wants to talk about the water, Rosa said. Eliza dried her hands. Is Mr. Granger in there? Yes. He asked if you could come. She went. Tom Aldridge was a man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with the particular combination of sun damage and worry lines that marked a man who spent his days outdoors and his nights calculating margins. He stood when she came in, which she noted, and introduced himself with the slightly formal courtesy of someone raised to consider it important. "I heard what happened here," he said after the introductions. "About the fraud. About Croft's acquisition filing." He looked at Silas. "My wife found out from the Hendersons, who heard it from someone in town. I want to—" He stopped, recalibrated. "I want to understand what it would have meant. For us." Silas explained it clearly and without dramatizing. The water rights corridor, the consent decree, what Croft had been building toward. He laid it out with the same flat precision he used for everything that had cost him something to say. Tom Aldridge listened without interrupting. When Silas finished, he was quiet for a moment. "We would have lost the well," he said. It wasn't a question. "Eventually, yes," Silas said. "If Croft had acquired the Ridge property, he would have controlled access to the creek. He could have charged for it, restricted it, or simply denied it." Tom looked at his hands. "We've been on that land for 11 years, he said. "Built everything we have there." He paused. "My kids grew up on that water." The room was quiet. "It's protected now," Eliza said. It was the first thing she'd said since coming in, and both men looked at her. "The consent decree covers the full corridor. Croft can't touch those rights, and the precedent in the county record makes it much harder for anyone else to try the same approach." Tom looked at her with the direct attention of a man who'd been thinking about something for a while and had just been given the piece he needed. "You're the one who found it," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Mr. Granger found it," she said. "I helped him look." Tom was quiet again. Then he said to Silas, "I want to be clear that if there's anything, if Iron Ridge needs support, during the spring or at any other time, you come to us. You come to us first. The Aldridges and the Hendersons. I know I can speak for them both." He stopped, tried again. "I know we've been neighbors for years and we haven't— it's not been the kind of neighbor relationship it should have been. I'm saying that should change." Silas looked at him. "I'd appreciate that, Tom." Tom stood to leave. At the door he stopped and looked back at Eliza. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you." She nodded. He left. After he was gone, the sitting room was quiet for a moment. Silas was looking at the window. "He's not the type to say that kind of thing easily," he said. "I know," she said. 11 years and he's never been in this house before today." She thought about that. About the distance that accumulates between people who live close to each other when there's no particular reason to cross it. Not hostility, just the ordinary drift of separate lives. And about how sometimes it takes a near catastrophe to remind people that they're not actually separate at all, that they've been connected all along by something as basic and essential as water. "He'll be back," she said. "People generally come back once they've started." She was right about that. Through February and into March, there were 3 more visits from neighboring homesteaders. The Hendersons, a family named Breckett, who ran sheep on the eastern edge of the valley, and an older man named Cyrus Platt, who'd homesteaded alone on 40 acres of creek-adjacent land, and who arrived on a mule with a jar of preserved plums and a handshake for Silas that lasted a long time. Each of them had heard the story in some form. Each of them came to say, in their particular way, that they understood now what had nearly happened, and that they were paying attention now, and that Iron Ridge was not as alone as it might have believed itself to be. Eliza fed all of them. That was her contribution to each visit, the practical hospitality of a full table, coffee that was always fresh, something baked that nobody had been expecting. It sounds like a small thing. She knew it wasn't small. The table was where people stopped being visitors and became something closer to belonging, and she understood that function as clearly as she understood heat and time and the correct ratio of salt to flour. Cyrus Platt, on his way out, stopped in the cookhouse doorway. They all ended up in the cookhouse doorway at some point, she'd noticed. It was that kind of room. And said, "You know what this ranch smells like now?" She looked at him. He was old enough to be her father, this small, weathered man with his mule waiting outside. And he had the kind of eyes that had seen enough to not waste them on things that didn't matter. "What does it smell like?" she said. "Like somewhere worth coming back to," he said. He left. She stood in the cookhouse and held that for a moment, turning it over, And then she went back to the bread she was shaping and pressed her palms into the dough the way her grandmother had taught her, firmly, steadily, with the full weight of both hands. Spring came the way Montana spring always came. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a late freeze, followed by rain, followed by 3 days of real sunlight that made everything smell like cold mud and possibility. Eliza planted the herbs in containers in the first week of April and moved them to the south windowsill of the cookhouse where the light was best. And she watched them with the particular attention she brought to things that were new and therefore fragile. The kitchen garden went in the ground in the second week of May, once the frost risk had passed sufficiently. Garrett built the low stone border along the south wall of the main house for the basil. 2 days of careful work with flat stones from the creek bed, mortared in a way that would hold heat and reflect it back through the night. He was proud of it in the contained, showing-nothing way. He was proud of good work. She planted the basil on a Saturday morning, on her knees in the dirt, with Rosa handing her seedlings from the flat she'd been hardening off for 2 weeks. It was unglamorous work. Her knees hurt by the end of it, and she got dirt under her fingernails that took 3 washings to fully clear. But the plants went in straight and well-spaced and with enough room to become what they were supposed to become, which was the only thing you could do for something living. Give it the right conditions and then get out of the way. Pete found her at it and sat on the stone border and watched. "Is that the basil?" he asked. "That's the basil." "For Mrs. Granger," he said. He'd heard the story somewhere along the way. Rosa had probably told him. Rosa told him most things, eventually. "For the kitchen," Eliza said. "And yes, for her too." Pete was quiet for a moment. He'd been the new senior hand for 2 months now, a role that fit him the way she'd expected it to. Not perfectly, because nothing fit perfectly at first, but correctly. He'd made mistakes, 2 significant ones, and had handled both with the same quality she'd noticed in him from the beginning. He'd owned them without drama and fixed what could be fixed and learned the rest. Silas had told her he was more relieved than surprised. "Can I ask you something?" Pete said. "You're going to regardless," she said. He almost smiled. "When you walked in here that first day, with Decker laughing at you and the pantry empty and nobody expecting anything from you, what made you stay? Like, what made you not just turn around?" She sat back on her heels and looked at the row of basil seedlings in their new ground. "I was tired," she said. "I'd been walking for 3 weeks. I wasn't going to walk away from a roof and a stove because a man I'd just met was rude to me." She paused. "That's the practical answer. What's the other answer?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "I've spent most of my life being in places where people decided what I was before I opened my mouth," she said. "What I could do, what I was worth, what I was capable of. And I stopped making their assumptions my reality a long time ago." She looked at Pete. "Not because I'm exceptional. Because I got tired of letting other people's opinions be the ceiling." Pete looked at the basil. "Decker was wrong about you from the first second." "He was," she said. "But I didn't need him to know that. I just needed to know it myself and keep going." He nodded slowly. It had the quality of something being filed away carefully rather than just heard. "That's good," he said. "It took me a while to figure it out," she said. "Don't let anyone tell you it's obvious from the start. It isn't. It's something you arrive at, usually after you've spent some time letting other people be wrong about you and hurting for it." He was quiet. Then, "Were you scared that first day?" "Terrified," she said. He looked at her. "I was so tired I could barely stand," she said. "And I had a skillet and nothing else, and I was walking into a yard full of men who were already laughing at me. Of course I was scared." She picked up her trowel. "Being scared and moving forward anyway is just what courage is. It's not the absence of being scared. If there's nothing to be scared of, it doesn't take courage. It just takes momentum." Pete sat with that for a moment. Then he got up and helped her carry the empty seed flats back to the cookhouse. And they didn't say anything else on the walk, but it was the kind of silence that meant something had been completed rather than abandoned. Silas asked her to walk with him that evening after supper. This was not unusual. They'd fallen into the habit of it in the last couple of months. The evening walk around the property, checking the fence line or the livestock, or sometimes nothing specific, just walking the land the way people walk land they're responsible for and want to stay connected to. She'd come to look forward to it in a way that she didn't examine too closely, because some things were better approached sideways than directly. They walked the south pasture in the long spring light. the kind of May evening light that lasts until almost 9 and makes everything look more significant than it might otherwise. The cattle were in good shape. She could see that even without knowing cattle specifically, because healthy animals had the same quality as healthy people, a certain ease of being in their own bodies that was visible from a distance. Silas talked about the spring cattle count, about the fencing repairs on the east boundary, about the Aldridge family coming for supper the following Saturday. Tom had started coming every few weeks, sometimes with his wife, and the evenings had become something Eliza genuinely looked forward to, the particular pleasure of watching a tentative connection become a real one. Then Silas stopped walking. She stopped too. They were at the south edge of the pasture, where the ground rose slightly before dropping away toward the creek, and in the evening light you could see the full length of Iron Ridge from here. The main house, the barn, the cookhouse, the equipment shed, the long line of the bunkhouse, all of it sitting in the valley with the mountains behind it and the creek running silver in the distance. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. He was looking at the ranch, not at her, which she recognized as the way he approached things that cost him something. She'd learned his patterns the way she'd learned the men's footsteps, by paying attention over time, by caring enough to notice. "When Claire died," he said, "my wife. When she died, He stopped. He started again with a different approach, the way you sometimes have to. "I stopped believing this place was worth what it cost. The work, everything. I kept going because I didn't know how to stop, not because I thought it was worth it." He paused. "I hadn't thought it was worth it for a long time." She didn't say anything. This needed room to move. "You came through that gate and I almost didn't let you try," he said. I'd been going through the motions for so long that somebody new, somebody with any real energy, felt almost like an inconvenience, like I'd have to pay attention again, and I wasn't sure I remembered how." He turned to look at her. "And then you made that supper, and Pete Calloway came and talked to me, which he'd never done, and I walked into the cookhouse, and the place smelled like somewhere someone actually cared about, and something—" He stopped again. Something started coming back. The light was going golden and low across the pasture. "I'm not good at this," he said. "Saying things. Claire used to say I talked about feelings the way I talked about broken fence posts, like they were a problem to be assessed and repaired and not dwelled on." Eliza almost smiled. "That sounds about right." "She was generally right," he said. He looked at her with the directness he used when he'd decided to stop approaching something sideways. "I don't want you to stay because you work here. I want you to stay because—" He looked for the words and found them, slowly, the way he found most things. "Because this ranch makes sense again when you're in it. Because I make sense again. And I don't think that's just about the cooking." She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could have said, practical things, careful things, the hedged language of someone who'd been disappointed before and had built reasonable defenses. She had her own catalog of disappointments, her own history of being underestimated and overlooked and moved on from. She wasn't a woman without caution, and she wasn't without the specific wariness of someone who'd learned that caring deeply about something you could lose was a risk with real consequences. But she'd walked 200 miles on a broken boot through a Montana August because she believed that moving towards something was better than standing still in a safe place, and she wasn't going to stop believing that now. "I'm not staying because you need a cook," she said. He looked at her. "I stayed past needing a cook a long time ago," she said. "I think we both know that." He did something then that surprised her. He laughed. Not a big laugh, not performed, just the small, helpless laugh of a man who'd been working up to something serious and had it met with something true and direct. And the relief of it came out as laughter. She understood it exactly. "All right," he said. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," she said. They stood there for a moment in the evening light, two imperfect people on a piece of land that had come close to being lost and hadn't been. And around them the ranch went on doing what ranches do at the end of a long day, settling into itself, quieting, becoming the version of itself that exists when the work is done and there's a moment to just be what it is. She didn't reach for his hand. He didn't reach for hers. It was May, and there was a full summer ahead, and some things don't need to be rushed by people who've both learned the cost of moving too fast towards something they haven't earned yet. They walked back to the main house side by side, and the light went slowly down behind the mountains, and the smell of the kitchen garden came to them on the evening breeze, herbs and turned earth, and the faint specific green of new basil in its new ground. The weeks that followed had the quality of something building rather than something concluding, which was, Eliza thought, the right way for a life to feel. Not finished, not resolved into some final state, just moving, honestly, toward the next thing. She renegotiated the supply contracts again in June, this time for a full year rather than season by season, and got better terms because she demonstrated to both suppliers that Iron Ridge was a reliable account and that the person managing procurement knew what things actually cost and would not be managed otherwise. One of the suppliers, a man named Garfield who ran a dry goods operation out of Great Falls, sent a letter back saying he appreciated doing business with someone who did their homework, which she accepted as the compliment it was. She hired a kitchen helper in June as well, a girl named Dora, 16, from the Hendersons' homestead, who had the particular combination of quick hands and genuine curiosity that Eliza recognized as the foundation everything else could be built on. She taught Dora the way her mother had taught her, not by explaining principles first and demonstrating second, but by putting her hands in the work and talking through what she was doing as she did it. Learning through doing, with someone patient enough to let you make mistakes at a speed you could learn from. Dora burned the first batch of biscuits she made on her own. "What happened?" Eliza said, not unkindly. "Too hot," Dora said, looking at the blackened bottoms. "What do you do next time?" Dora thought about it. "Check the oven before I assume." "Right," Eliza said. "Now, make another batch." Dora made another batch. They were better. Not perfect. Still a little uneven, one side slightly more brown than the other, but better. And better was the direction. Burl came in while Dora was pulling them out and took one without asking, which was his established relationship with the cookhouse, and ate half of it before he said, "These are good." Dora looked like she'd been given something she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. "Don't get proud," Eliza said, which was what her grandmother had always said when she looked too pleased with herself, and which she said now with the same tone. Not dampening, just calibrating. Dora grinned. "I'm only a little proud." "A little is fine," Eliza said. Summer moved away. Montana summer moves, fast and bright, like it knows it's temporary and wants to mean something before the cold comes back. The kitchen garden on the south wall came in better than she'd dared plan for. The basil was particularly good, dark and fragrant and abundant, the stone border doing exactly what she'd hoped, holding the heat through the cool nights. She cut it back regularly to keep it from going to seed, which was a practice in the particular discipline of tending things, the willingness to cut back what's thriving in order to keep it producing. She used it in everything that summer. In sauces, in salads, tucked under the skin of roasted chickens, dropped into soups in the last minute to keep it bright. Ate a tomato salad with fresh basil. One evening in August, and looked at it with the expression of someone encountering a new color. "This is from the garden?" he said. "Where else?" she said. He ate it slowly, which was unusual for Pete, who generally ate with the focused efficiency of a young man who'd learned to eat fast before the food ran out. This time he ate slowly, tasting it. "Mr. Granger's wife wanted to grow basil," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "She did," Eliza said. He looked at the bowl. Then he looked at Eliza. "I think she'd like this," he said simply, without weight. "I think so too," Eliza said. It wasn't a sad moment, which surprised her slightly. It was instead a complete one, the feeling of a circle that had been open for too long finally finding its other end, gently, without fanfare. She thought about a woman she'd never met who'd wanted basil in Montana and been told it couldn't be done. And she thought about the stone border Garrett had built and the seedlings she'd hardened off on the south windowsill and the deep, fragrant bowl of it on the table, and she thought, it could be done. It just needed someone stubborn enough to try. She was, it turned out, exactly that stubborn. The summer passed and the fall came in again, and with it the first anniversary of Eliza Rowan's arrival at Iron Ridge Ranch. She didn't mark it out loud. Silas didn't either, though she suspected he knew the date the same way she knew the date, not because either of them was sentimental about calendars, but because some days leave a mark that you don't forget no matter how much else accumulates on top of them. She stood in the cookhouse that morning and looked at the shelves, full, properly labeled, organized the way she'd organized them from the beginning, and maintained without drama through an entire year of daily use. The stove was clean, the knives were sharp, the garden herbs were in their labeled jars for the winter, dried and stored with the methodical care that was simply how she did things. She thought about the gate, the laughter, the burlap on her right foot, and the 8-pound skillet in her hand, and the 52 men who hadn't known she was coming and hadn't wanted her once she arrived. She thought about Pete's broom and Burl's admission, and Rosa's careful key and Garrett's stone border, and Tom Aldridge sitting in the main house for the first time in 11 years of being a neighbor. She thought about a notebook full of price comparisons, and a lockbox in a supply barn, and a letter from Great Falls that said $9.65 per 100 pounds, and the look on Silas Granger's face when he pressed his hand flat against the desk. She thought about what it had cost, all of it. The weeks of holding herself steady while something large and dangerous moved around her. The long evenings at the supply ledgers. The discipline of saying nothing before she had enough to say something real. The particular loneliness of knowing something nobody else in the room knew yet and having to carry it carefully until the right moment. She thought about what her mother had always told her. You don't get to decide whether people make room for you, but you get to decide what you do with yourself in the meantime. She'd made a lot of decisions in the meantime. Not all of them right, not all of them clean. She'd been afraid more often than she'd shown, and uncertain more often than she'd admitted, and there had been nights in that small room at the back of the main house when she'd lain awake and wondered if she'd overreached, if she should have stayed in her lane, if the lane she'd been given was the lane she was actually supposed to travel. But she'd gotten up every morning and started the fire and made the coffee and fed 50 men and kept her eyes open and her notebook closed and her skillet on the stove where it belonged. And here was the ranch, whole, running, loud with the ordinary noise of people who had somewhere to be and enough to eat and reasons to stay. She heard Silas's footsteps in the hall. She knew them as well as her own now, that particular even cadence of a man who moved through his own home like he meant to be there. He came through the cookhouse door and stopped when he saw her standing in the middle of the room, not doing anything specific. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said, thinking. About what? She looked around the room, the shelves, the stove, the window with the morning light coming through it, the row of dried herbs in their jars, the hook where her skillet hung, a cookhouse that looked like someone cared about it because someone did. About how things that almost didn't happen are sometimes the things that matter most, she said. He considered that. He came and stood beside her, looking at the same room she was looking at, and she appreciated that he didn't try to turn it into something smaller or larger than it was. "Are you staying?" he said. He said it quietly, not with the weight of everything behind it, just as a question being asked on a particular morning to a particular person. She looked at him. "I already told you I was." "That was in May," he said. "It's still true," she said. He nodded. He moved to the stove and lifted the coffee pot to check its weight. He poured 2 cups, which had become simply what happened in the morning in this kitchen, and he set one in front of her and held the other. Outside, Pete crossed the yard toward the barn, calling something over his shoulder to one of the newer hands. Dora would arrive in an hour to start the breakfast prep, which she was now competent to begin without instruction, a fact that still gave Eliza the quiet pleasure of something you'd put effort into working the way it was supposed to. The sun was coming up properly behind the mountains, that particular early light that turned the ridge creek to copper and made the whole valley look briefly like something painted. Iron Ridge Ranch in October, 1 year from the day she'd walked through the gate with nothing but a skillet and a body full of knowledge nobody had bothered to ask about yet. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. It was the right temperature, which was a small thing and also not a small thing. "We need to talk about the winter supply order," she said. "I know," Silas said. "Garfield quoted me better prices if we commit to a quarterly volume." "Then we commit," he said. She nodded. She set down her cup and went to the shelf for her notebook, and he pulled a chair from the table and sat down with his coffee, and they got to work. That was what it looked like in the end. Not a grand conclusion, not a ceremony or a speech or a clean line across the page. Just 2 people at a kitchen table in the morning, making plans for the next thing. Doing the work of a life built out of attention and stubbornness, and the willingness to show up again the next day, even when the previous day had cost you something. The skillet hung on its hook by the stove, seasoned black and heavy and permanent, the way a thing gets when it's been used honestly for a long time. It wasn't going anywhere. Neither was she.